Do not attempt to adjust your settings. We have commandeered this channel and are now streaming our pirate broadcast. This is the Pirate Stream. Welcome to the Pirate Stream, Dialectical Dissidents. This is Courtenay Turner. I'm Ryan Cristian. Thank you for joining us today. Lots of interesting things to talk about. Of course, haven't been together for a while, so we have to kind of catch up on all the crazy stories. But how are you? What's going on?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I know. I did a show talking about the Sustains Act and how I think they're trying to push that through right before the Summit of the Future. But there was so much happening. That was right after the Trump attempted assassination attempt. Right. And I think I said repeatedly, if only these psychopaths could slow down, because I can't keep up with all the stuff that's going on. But they don't seem to. So,
well, it's just on that opening note. What's so interesting about it? I mean, obviously, all of these stories and some of which we'll talk about today have their own relevance. It is, but whether they're manipulations or not, there's always points to be made. But it's so sad that something that important. And maybe you can reiterate for people what that was about. We talked about it on this show, and as well as many times you've discussed it in your own work about how wildly important this is. I mean, Frank, I'm honestly, outside of you, I haven't seen really anybody talking about this, and I'm sure it's out there. But it's so sad that these stories can kind of just eclipse these larger conversations, which will directly affect our lives.
Yes, and that's absolutely true. Other than American Stewards for Liberty, I have not seen anybody covering it.
Who is it again?
American Stewards for Liberty.
Interesting. Okay, check them out.
They are Margaret Byfield was on my show when they were trying to push the NACs through, and she got into this kind of through a battle legally with the government over her family's land. So this has been kind of a personal, ongoing pursuit for her. Right. And so they're doing a great job. But other than that, I really have not heard anybody talk about it. And I found out about it very late. Somebody had messaged me saying that they saw that article and said the NACs are back. And so unfortunately, I felt terrible because I was very behind the game, And I was like,
it's always on our shoulders, isn't it? You feel like it's your fault.
I know. And I'm like, I have to get the word out. I have to sound the alarm. And we have this deadline. And then
it's what makes us good. It's what makes you good at this work.
Thank you.
You feel personal responsibility for it.
I do, because I mean that's if we're, what else are we doing? Right. So whatever voice I have and can get to others, that's there's no other reason to do this. So so I was supposed to be on InfoWars on Monday. And I said, okay, well, the deadline is midnight Eastern time, Monday night. That's fine, because that's kind of what happened with the NACs too. Right. It was the 11th hour, and we did push back. We pushed back enough that they withdrew the proposal, which is great. But as I said, I knew we had to stay vigilant, because they were just going to rebrand and they were going to come back
as always.
Yep. And so, but then I think, there were other stories that came up. And so they moved me to the next day. And I said, okay, we're past the deadline, but I still think we should sound the alarm. Let's flood their inboxes. And they were super sneaky about it. They shut down the comments. You couldn't even send. They put up misspelled emails, because I called and got the email, the correct email. One of them they just took down completely. The other one was a direct contact. And she said, oh, they misspelled my name. Of course. Very convenient.
Yeah.
So now I look kind of like an idiot. I keep retweeting. Okay, here's where you go. Here's where you go. Right. But yeah, so it's called the Sustains Act. And this is where they're, again, trying to commodify the air we breathe. But it's under the guise of what they call environmental services. Now, environmental services are literally the air we breathe, photosynthesis.
Services, like they provide these things for us.
they provide pollination.
Like the hubris, right?
Seriously. So the pollination, the quality of the air in open space, these are environmental services. And of course, there's a lot of money at stake. This is all tied to like carbon credits, carbon sequestering, biodiversity credits. And it's all arbitrary, because who determines who has ownership of these environmental services? The secretary of the USDA. So Tom Vilsack is like the authority now, and he can say, you have it, you have it. And this is the thing that I really want to stress to people. This is on private land. So this could be on your property. You own a home, you own a farm, you own an oil facility, whatever it is, you own that. And you think that you would have purview over something you own, right? Like, I own this phone and I control what happens on here. Right. But no, they're saying they control the services. And so they can, and it's all part of the degrowth agenda. So they can say, well, it's bad for the environment, so you can't plant flowers, you
Right.
can't plant trees.
And give themselves passes for what they do when they want to, and so on.
Exactly. And so so this is all, and they're also tying this to, they think that they've estimated that all the value of privately owned land in the United States is worth $32 trillion. So they're going to put this up as collateral,
Of course,
for the national debt.
because
So
they
now-
own it all, right? I mean, there's no way to look at that other than they see that as theirs, that you're being given access to.
Well, and they kind of do. I know this is not a popular opinion, but I really like I detest property taxes on principle.
Right.
And I know this was important to a lot of the founders, and I know it's not popular to say this, but here's
agree.
why I detest it, because it feels like a lie. If you own something, you own it outright. You buy this microphone, this is yours. You have purview over it. You can do what you want with this. If you want to vandalize it, it's yours to do so. Not advocating that. I'm just saying, like, you do what you want with your property. But as we've seen throughout history, typically when somebody owns something, they actually take better care of it.
Right.
If they want to reap the value, the intrinsic value. But when you own property, you have to pay property taxes. What happens if you default on those taxes?
Right.
The government seizes it. So essentially you lease the land from the government.
Right.
And it makes my skin boil.
I mean, your point about this in particular is the same thing, but what about other things that have been there before, like eminent domain, or like these things that we know governments will absolutely abuse these things, lie about them, surprise, surprise, to take effect, to take control of something, or even from a personal government perspective from within that, or corporations driving their actions. So this, and go ahead and what does NAC stand for again for the audience?
So that was the natural asset companies. So if we back up a bit, what they were trying to do, this was months ago, but they were trying to put a proposed rule with the SEC. They were proposing this rule that they would put natural asset companies up on the New York Stock Exchange. And this was the Intrinsic Exchange Group who had partnered with the New York Stock Exchange. So they're double dipping on both sides.
Always.
And of course, their primary backers were the Rockefellers. I think it was Douglas Egger. I'm blanking on his name, but I think that was it. He's the CEO. And he gave this very elaborate speech talking about how it's been so hard to find partners, to fund this. But the Rockefellers just understand with these kind of things, sometimes you just have to keep dumping money into it because it's just worth it. Yeah. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically
trillions of dollars worth it, right?
Yes, trillions of dollars. But it is because they estimated that they were going to make upwards of $5 quadrillion. That's a number I can't fathom that. Like, I don't think any human can.
I think you get past even a billion. Like, if you actually seen one of those graphics, I've played one on the show before. You get past 1 million into a billion. Like, your mind, like she's saying, you're incapable of really grasping it. You can say the number out loud, but it
means nothing. You might as well just say infinite at that point.
And that's the point, the game they play with the debt at this point, where it's like, clearly they just kind of don't even care about that anymore, right? And they used to be pretend like we're trying to fix that problem.
In Times Square.
Yeah. Now it just goes falling further. I mean, even just right now, funding Israel or COVID-19, that number has gone shockingly through the roof in a very short period of time because people just don't care. It's like, it's just a big number, But go ahead.
I was just going to say, but with this Sustains Act, I mean, Sustains, it's in the name, right? It's all about achieving their sustainable development goals. I don't think it's a coincidence that they're trying to push this through very quietly before the Summit of the Future. And this is tied to, I know people think it sounds crazy when you say like this thing is tied to this thing, but it is all interconnected because they're trying to create what they call the oneness, the whole, right? This is the undifferentiated all. That's their goal. But this is tied to the One World Agriculture Initiative.
Right.
And the One World Agriculture Initiative, it's really important for people to understand they want to create completely synthetic food where forget like bugs. I mean, they don't want everything's going to be GMO.
Right. Something they can manufacture from, like they can create as opposed to having to utilize.
Exactly. Yeah. So because it's part of the degrowth agenda, and the degrowth agenda is tied to what they call the 30 by 30. They changed the name of it, this 30 by 30 land grab, because people pushed back and they realized, hey, we don't really like that. That was about how by 2030, 30% of the world's earth water cannot be inhabited or used by humans. And so this is just stepping stone to get to the half earth agenda that E.O. Wilson laid out in his book in 2016. But they renamed it to America the Beautiful which just sounds so lovely. So do not be deceived. This is not about celebrating the land and the resources we are blessed to have in America. That's not what this is about. This is about taking away our ability to utilize this land, and to not just utilize, but to make it prosperous and produce. And so, yeah, it's all about the degrowth, and you can't use it. And so that's why they advocate synthetic. But if everything is GMO, first of all, I don't know how humans will survive eating literally, synthetic food, which I would argue is not food. Yeah. And then do they become patentable because we're all same
GMO. Point with the COVID-19 overlap, right? I mean, the injections are genetically modified. I mean, you are being modified. And so the question, and that's nice. Every time I bring this up in the past, and I'm sure you probably got the same resistance. People act like it does seem outlandish, right? It seems like it is a big step in many different directions, but it's objectively a reality, right? If it really comes down to a legal perspective. And I used to play this video often when that first happened, when they decided you could patent a living thing, right? That once that we went beyond that, it's a dangerous step, because at what point do they make the legal argument that, well, your genetic code own that? And that's, I mean, hopefully there's someone with perspective that can be like, that's a step too far, but somebody, a judge or a grouping of people with an interest in it, could easily argue that makes sense, like Monsanto and the seeds they were using, and how they would say that about farms. The wind just blew it into their farm. Now we own your farm. It's exactly the same thing.
It is exactly the same thing.
That's scary.
It's very scary. There's a great article by Zero Hedge, and I've got the title, but it's something about trans farming to transhuman. Yeah. And it lays this whole thing out in a lot of detail.
Yeah.
Great piece, so.
That's it's an alarming step that is absolutely happening as we speak. I mean, these things are, whether it's about the individual human being or specific living concepts, I mean, it is underway. So I recommend you check out her work around that, because this is a building issue. But to segue this into something else we're going to talk about today, which I think is a perfect conversation about this, right? So we're talking about, whether it's about like conquering or taking, or through some kind of a contract, taking control of these assets, and really under a guise of saying, we're going to make this better for the planet. And the exact opposite is taking place. You might have seen me discuss the idea of this alleged, being framed as a libertarian utopia city, when it's, my opinion, couldn't be farther from the truth, called Prospera. Oh, really? Prospera is one example of a few of these that they have going in Honduras right now. I think there's 3 of them in total. Now, really, to break this down for the audience, I recommend you check out this show, because I've gone through it pretty in depth, and I plan on doing a lot more on this. We're talking about a city I guess you can call it a city. I mean, it's an occupation of these areas. It's a Peter Thiel-backed company that is through manipulative government and overlapping business contracts, so fascist in a way, taking control of this area. Now, it started in 2009 in Honduras, when the U.S. government, and this is pretty public knowledge today, backed a coup and from that forward had a series of really bad leaders who drove the country. I mean, even today, it's considered one of the most dangerous places in the world. It's wild. And so at that point,
and here it's so beautiful.
I've heard this. I mean, I've seen the images. It's a beautiful place.
The pictures too.
Yeah.
But I knew people who were from there.
It's sad, right? I mean, I know I could speak to California is a beautiful place, which is pretty terrible today too. I grew up there. But so you have this place that was, through government policy or illegal action, used a coup to take control. Now, whether these things were done in unison or not is up for you to decide. But one thing that happened along with that is that they used the chaos that they sowed into this location to justify what they called special development zones, which is right out of 2030 agenda, right? At least in the specific location, they call them ZEEDs, Z-E-D-E, but it's the same concept. Now, the reason they were able to do that, even though the Constitutional Court originally pushed back on it and said, that's crazy, you're taking our sovereignty, is because, the normal legal process. You remove the judges and put ones in place that won't vote the way you want them to. Right. Okay, that's literally what happened. And so then they got it passed where they would allow these zones. Now, coming forward to more so today, the problem is that they have continued to take control of this area. Local people involved the predominantly Hondurans are openly against this. Now, if you clearly point out that this was a contract made with an illegal government, and it was a contract that people argue was violating their sovereignty to begin with, it's still technically a contract, right? Right? So the problem is that now you have a government that was put back. You could argue that people voted this government in place. I argue that the reason I think that makes sense is the U.S., I would argue, would want to maintain a government they can control, but I think it's all clear to everyone they're losing influence around the world. I think they're spread pretty thin. And so I would argue that they had an election and they were able to get people that the people wanted to vote in. And you could, either way you want to look at it, I think the outcome shows you this. But the point is that they ran almost entirely on the idea that we're going to get rid of these special zones. And the people were like, absolutely. So they voted these people in. So now you've got a government in place today that is against this. They immediately changed the law. Right? The law is no longer that's allowed. Well, first point to point out is that the Prospera group, or rather the company, is currently building another one inside of the island. I think it's Roatan, where Prospera is,
Roatan.
despite the fact that the law is no longer there. So to me, that shows you that they obviously don't care about the law. Now, where this becomes really interesting, aside from the obvious, like, you know, again, it's a fake libertarian utopia. It's not even remotely that. They've really not even built that much, that it's not that. But the point is that's a story alone. But it gets interesting where you realize that because that's now changed, the company, Thiel's company, is suing the government of Honduras under this contract. Even though they're arguing, if you flesh this out, you can see that they didn't even meet the requirements of the original contract. But the point is it's going through the World Bank because it's an international concept, which I think the U.S. influences. So if they sue them, and they're suing for $11 billion, their GDP is like 35 billion. What happens if they win? Right? What happens if they win and effectively take assets control away from these of the Honduras government? The government doesn't go away, but now you've got a company, I argue technocrats, who have control of literally everything in the country. So what are we talking about right there? And one last point about this is that now the current government is saying the U.S. government right now is about to coup us again. That she said this on September 5th in more than one setting, that they're going to coup us yet again. They're marshaling resources right now. And whether that's true or not, I argue that the reason that makes sense is because the way that the company's acting seems to demonstrate that they see that they won't have to worry about the laws in place. So it gives me the indication that they might think that there is a coup coming. So all that said, it seems like a technocratic takeover of Honduras, at least a trial balloon in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's a trial. Well, there's so much to say about this. The first thing I do want to say is that this is very like a, you know, Atlas Shrugged, who Galt kind of an operation. And I was telling you this before we started, but it's a rumor. So don't come at me and be like, where's your evidence? But it is a rumor, but I can totally see how this could be the case. But there's a rumor that Ayn Rand was a Rothschild mistress, Jacob Rothschild's mistress, and that it was her mission was to create, particularly Atlas Shrugged, as a propaganda piece to outline the blueprint of, you know, what the so-called elites, the powers that shouldn't be, what they would do. But what I really see, the reason why I give some credibility to this possible theory, it is a theory, is because it looks like such a great dialectic. It's a great honeypot. And when I see these Randians, what happened is, and I was, you know, as a kid, I read The Fountainhead and I loved The Fountainhead. Then when I first moved to LA, I, tried to join a bunch of groups just to make friends, and I felt very outside. So what did I do? I joined a bunch of like really dorky reading groups, and Atlas Shrugged reading group was one of the things I did. So I was one of these like diehard Ayn Rand fans, but what I see, and not to say that there's no merit in any of her philosophy, because if there were, then it wouldn't be effective. Yeah,
it's always partly true. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. They marry the truth to lies, or they, weaponize the truth. But what I see is it's really built this perfect dialectic of this hyper individuality, this kind of extreme capitalistic kind of mindset. And people do need to remember, I'm all for free markets. However, the term capitalism is actually from Marx. Marx is supposedly like the conservative, opponent, and everybody. But meanwhile, they use his dialectical framing, right? And people like Brzezinski and Kissinger outlined very clearly how they were going to use the clash of ideologies like capitalism and communism, or fascism and communism, to usher in the technocratic takeover. Right. And I very much see that happening. And it is right now these Randians who seem to be like the most staunch, like they get so adamant. And I can see how when you appeal to them, whether or not this is really, I think it's kind of a false, I think it's a honeypot. I don't think it's truly libertarian, but it has that
objectively, I think it's not.
No, I agree with you. Yeah. But the exoteric veneer, the messaging is, right? And I hear this all the time because I would argue Peter Thiel is a technocrat. But what I hear is, and I would argue he's a transhumanist, right? But what I hear from those who, the people who want to take that adversarial stance, they say, well, no, he's a libertarian, so he's still for freedom. Okay, but what is his end goal? Right. What is his telos, right? Yeah. Where is he driving this towards? And Really, I think this is all part of creating the beta test. So to get back to this, it's creating the beta test for the AI World Society, where they have this grid of all of these nodes, which Ukraine, they've said repeatedly, they did that whole symposium on rebuilding Ukraine, and it's going to be the central node for all of these smart cities, C40 cities, 15-minute cities.
Right.
And another thing worth noting is that a subset of Prospera is Vitalia. And Vitalia is all about life extension. And they talk about how death is optional. Yeah, I mean, why die? Why get old if it's optional? But
I'm sure all the Christian conservatives out there will love that. You know,
Who?
I said, I'm sure all the Christian conservatives out there will love that. There's so many contradicting ideologies within the illusion that is, you know, really all sides of the paradigm.
I think it's to create these dialectics that, you know, it's the right-hand path. They need a right-hand path. But what I was going to say is, does this sound a little bit like Yuval Noah Harari? He talked about how during the old days of, you know, Noah's Ark, most people didn't fare so well. And then, you know, in the floods, and then there was the ark that saved the few. And he said, well, next time around, it's like most people won't do so well, but there's going to be a scientific ark. Wow. And the scientific elite, which would be the technocrats, right? They will flourish and they may become immortal. I don't know if he actually said that, you know, but that's what he alluded to.
He said that many versions of that many times.
Yeah, but he did say the scientific arc. That part he absolutely said. And I don't know if he said they'll become immortal, but that's what he was alluding to. He said they will thrive. He did say that.
Of course.
But this is what it reminded me of. That's exactly what that reminded me of. And I think it's all about creating these, it's really a technocratic and neo-feudal system. That's what they want. And I think that when you talked a little bit, that was one more point, and then I'll
take your time.
You talked about how American influence, and I think it's a little bit more nuanced. I really do see this kind of like Anglo-American establishment. And I think America has been propped up. I think even our financial system was created to do this, to be the frontmen, to be the bullies. And now is the time to expose that, right? Weaponize the truth. We've been the bullies all over the world. So they're ready to take us down because they need to take down the United States in order to create their one world government. Right.
Well, and this is kind of a smaller, like it's the macrocosm of the idea being that the Donald Trump idea, where this is a theory that's put forward about how he would be put in place in order to just like have it fall down at his feet and be like, well, blame it on that kind of idea. And so you can see a similar thing in this concept where, you know, I completely agree. And I think it's about setting up the illusion of that the US was, you know, necessary at the time. And, you know, now we're at a point where it's an old archaic idea, but the reality being, as you're saying, it was always kind of designed like the engineered fall of the West to drive in the, you know, I always cite James Corbett's work on that because he's been talking about that for like a decade, you know, and at least, and even to the point of multiple things, like whether we're talking about shifting into some global technocracy or maybe just shifting to another state power before we do, you know, there are different possibilities.
I think they're shifting towards you know, these supranational power blocks. A lot of it's through the corporations. And I really think that's kind of, and I feel like COVID was a really great beta test for that. Because I always use this example. It didn't matter if you lived in rural New York State, you know, on a farm where your nearest neighbor was like 10,000 miles away. Or if you lived in Manhattan proper. If you went into a Target, you were subject to whatever policies that big box store had. And I think that was a beta test for all of these policies. All the big box stores and all these supranational corporations are hook, line, and sinker with whatever 17 sustainable goals agenda puts forth. So I think that's kind of, then that they kind of take over the power. And then when they talk about the AI World Society, they say that all governments are going to be supplanted by AI. There'll be no human government. So.
They like Schmidt has made that case many times that how we'll have to kind of bow to the AI in the future. You know, it's such an alarming thing. And it's so obvious on the face of the conversation, but I think most people choose not to acknowledge it or that it's even there. And it's so terrifying. So like back to this main point, you know, we're talking about this obvious corporate entity that is choosing to occupy territory. And what I didn't mention as well is I think we said it off air, there's a little town called Crawfish Rock. It's like right outside the current Prospera boundary. And ultimately, and this has been publicly discussed, I believe the current leadership just made a case about this, that the Prospera entity, or rather that location, put out another statement saying that they were about to absorb Crawfish Rock, and the people were up in arms about that. Like, so the question right there, like, even if you think that this makes sense, even if you think it's libertarian, which I think on its face, it's clear that it's not, you're talking about them just choosing to go, well, we'll just absorb you despite what you want. And it's like, it has to show you that this is clearly outside the bounds of even what they're presenting it as. So what's the real intention? You know, I think it's exactly what Courtenay is saying, is it's a trial balloon, or it's kind of testing out the way that we respond to this, or seeing if it just seeing if we can make it a positive case, right? Turn it around and say, look at how we saved Honduras from itself. You know,
Right.
it overlaps with the point that Dan Cohen just made in my recent interview with him about the Global Fragility Act. And Haiti right now, where the argument being that they're trying to use this act, and this was something signed into law on Donald Trump, but I think it really applies to any side of the paradigm, that we're ultimately using the idea, it's kind of classic foreign policy, that you're so unstable largely because you've made that happen from a world government perspective, but that we need to step in and sort of do it for you. And that overlaps with all of these same things, even with the NIC point. Yep. You know, it's like we have to manage that because you're not taking good control of these, even though these outside corporations you've allowed in are the ones destroying it. You know, it never ends.
Exactly. I think it's really interesting, the names,
Mm-hmm.
Prospera. So it has this appeal to very much like a libertarian capitalist kind of mindset. It's going to be prosperous and money making. I think that's just interesting. I don't think this is coincidence. I think they're very strategic when they do these things. And then they're the sub company of Vitalia, all about, vitality and life. But really it's death, because if you think about the transhuman agenda means death to humans. They call it humanity 2.0, which means what happens to human 1.0.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and then what about, go ahead and outline what Vitalia is if you want to go into more detail. Because I mean, even for myself, because I'm only briefly familiar, but also the other aspect. I mean, I believe, what is it? Is it ambrosia? That I think Peter Thiel and other, it's basically that very weird story that is 100% real. They've even just joked about on different shows of taking blood of younger people and injecting it and giving yourself more time, more life. Like
adrenochrome.
In a similar way, yeah. But I mean, this is, I take time to look this up. They made a joke about it on Silicon Valley. A whole article was written, I think, by The Guardian, but it's a very real thing. And my point in and of it's like just at a surface level, when I first saw that, was like, okay, well, then anything like this being in existence guarantees a black market. So we're going to acknowledge for young children's blood. I mean, it's a terror. Just even saying it like that gets people that want to go, that's fake. I can't even listen to that. That sounds crazy.
Right.
But it's very real. Even if you think it's all being done legally, it's just this weird overlap with all the what we're talking about. They do it in
cosmetics very overtly. I mean,
that clip of Sandra Bullock, remember she talked about the skin cream she was using?
Yeah, and the exosomes and PRP, and most of it is using younger blood in order to. Yeah, that's where it comes from.
That's terrifying. I mean, just in and of itself. I mean, it really in history it goes back a long way too. I think what was it? I forget was it Cleopatra? I forget the one of them supposedly bathed in blood because they thought that it gave them more life. Things like that. It's a very elitist kind of mindset using the peons.
When you think about it that way, it's very disturbing.
It is. It is.
So this is, you can go to vitalia.city and it looks beautiful. And it says, come build a new city to make death optional. Join Vitalia. And it does seem, and then they have like a whole link tree all about it. And they have come build the city of life. So I guess they're marketing it as you're going to very libertarian. It's very John Galt, actually. So it's this idea that you're going to build your own kind of city, which it's interesting. And a lot of it's surrounding crypto.
Of course.
But that to me just looks like a beta test for central bank digital currencies. And I know people think crypto Bitcoin is decentralized and it's separate, but once they figured out how they can use that as a infrastructure for the control, then they can just deregulate all, make it illegal. And yes, you'll have a black market, but I mean, people barter on a black market. So I don't think that's a really good argument.
But it's worth also fleshing out, because it's a lot broader in the idea of what cryptocurrencies and because I think a lot of people tend to, not that you were doing this, but in general, see it as Bitcoin, like it's all one thing. And the reality being that there's cryptocurrency,
No, that's what I'm
there's
saying.
blockchain. No, exactly. Yeah. And we have to realize that there are many different forms of it that might be used. Like, I think it's important to take a skeptical stance against all of it and be, concerned about how it might be used. But your point about this is very valid. Like, that's also Prospera, by the way. They're using Bitcoin as like the sole point. Elon Musk has allowed Starlink, but only for Prospera, not Hondurans. Like, it's a very weird. On that note, actually, my personal opinion, because they just hey, we gave it to Yemen. No, you didn't. You gave it to the ruling factions that are trying to take over Yemen. So I think Starlink is being used. Well, I mean, it's obviously militarily being used. Yeah. But I think his rolling it out in these countries are the guys that we're helping the populations. It indicates another field of war that's about to kick off, in my opinion. That's what my gut tells me.
Well, it is. I mean, SpaceX is a whole intel operation.
He's a military contractor.
He's a contractor. Elon is a contractor. Right. So
for Biden's administration, let alone think about that.
I know, and he's always he always plays like the he's the adversary. He's like their opponent, and he's going to be the savior. But meanwhile, who's hiring him?
Right.
Who's he an employee of?
The good AI, right? Yeah. Well, to your point about this, I just highlighted. This is what it says right on the website. Vitalia is building a city, which is interesting. So when you said it, I wasn't thinking. So it's also a city. Yes. This is exactly the same thing. Yep. And it's accelerating the progress of life extension. So they're building this with the sole direction of trying to extend people's lives. Yep. Everything about
transhuman agenda.
Literally, quite literally. It's just terrifying. And so here, what's interesting to me. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it reminds me also a little bit of Burning Man.
Well, yeah, I think they do that on purpose. They're trying to tap into this. There's a weird conversation to be had about like the old hippie 60s time frame and how they've become like the technocrat. I think we've talked about that before.
Yeah. Well, and that's not a coincidence. It's the same people behind it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you think that the individual people, so you mean the people that were manipulating then or manipulating now?
Yeah, the people manipulating. I mean, the same people who were driving that hippies, free love movement were the people who were attending the Macy's conferences and the cybernetic foundations.
It's the same thing we're dealing with today. Like everyone's coming up and acting like they're the one that's going to save you. They're the one Pied Pipering you. And it's the same cycle. Like you made a good point about Brzezinski and the rest that made they've talked about it. We're going to use these things to distill you into one position.
Yes.
And yet we all still seem to keep falling for the same tricks over and over.
Over and over.
I mean, just on that side note, and I'd like we can solve the world's problems in this next 30 seconds, but how do you reach these people? What do you do to reach the people like that? That, you have all the facts in front of you. Right. What's your mindset on that?
To reach the people who are being trapped in the woods.
So if you can demonstrate, like, look, it's literally the policy stated by, I would say the government, but I guess neocons or however you want to frame it, that they would use the dialectic, they would use left and right, they would use whatever to make sure they can drive you into the position they want you, the false binary, right? Like, how do you reach people even with the facts in front of you, but they just don't want to see it? Like, in your perspective.
Well, that's part of why I just did the Cognitive Liberty Conference, because I think that's a huge part of it, is teaching people the roots of dialectical warfare, so they can recognize it and then hopefully step outside the wizard circle. Yeah. And then, I mean, there are people who are just like, willfully ignorant. Right. When you talk about like these, another really great example of speaking to this point. So one of the funders of this Prospera is the Koch brothers.
Of course.
And they were instrumental in a lot of these, what look like neocon, but people thought conservative movements, things like John Birch Society. They infiltrated and funded. Right now, even here in Tennessee, they've been very instrumental in kicking out a bunch of our legislators. They started a whole pack, and it was the Koch brothers who funded this largely. And I actually got a call from one of the senators saying that I was one of the reasons he didn't get reelected. I was like, what did I do? And he said it was because I had been brought in to speak on the NACs. And he said, you did a great job, but you did such a great job that they kicked out a bunch of the conservation easement bills. And so as a result, they got rid of me. And it was partly this pack, but I also think that
they abused what you did to take advantage.
Exactly. And so it wasn't directly me, but the way he worded it, I was like, what did I do? Like, I'm so sorry. I love him, he's wonderful. He was such an ally for good. I mean, really somebody who's been there for so long, researching, really knows what the agenda is, what they're doing.
We have some pretty good local politicians in Tennessee. Like, I'm very jaded, but I have to admit there's some people.
But this whole pack was designed, I think largely this was all about the voucher system, the school vouchers. And this is no longer like a local issue because there's now an initiative to make the vouchers federal, a national voucher system. And this is all tied to the World Core Curriculums. And we're back to the UN agenda again.
Right.
This is Robert Mueller's World Core Curriculum, which became Common Core in the United States. And they say of their own words, this is about putting every child into a computer. So it's all about the technocratic.
All roads lead back, and it's the same idea. Well, let me ask you this about the Koch brothers part of it on a specific. Do you think that is like, just by saying that, people would read that as they're doing that to frame the Republicans?
Yes.
But do you see that as a bigger idea, that it's more about not framing it aside, but rather it's like it's part of the false dichotomy, like the bigger picture?
Yes. So I do. So when you ask, like, how do I reach those people who just they don't want to see that there is this false binary? I think, humans want to feel like they don't want to feel helpless. Right. They want to feel like there's something they can anchor to. And I think also sometimes, I've had this response to some of my work before. It's like, I need a college course just to understand what you just said, and I always try to distill things, make things really accessible. This is not my goal at all, but I understand it. It's not because I'm trying to make it complicated. It's because they've intentionally, what did Nietzsche say? They muddy the water so it appears deep. Right. That's exactly what they do by design.
That's our political system in general.
Yeah.
It seems overcomplicated. People just check out.
Right. Yeah. And so people just, okay, I don't know what to do. It's over my head. So when I did this Cognitive Liberty Conference, because I really think that we have been dumbed down.
Oh, yeah.
And intentionally, we have also been bred for compliance. So, I think if we can get back to giving people foundational tools to, create independent critical thinking skills. Yeah. But ultimately, just a really simple thing that people can do is just, we're so primed to react. So anytime there is a situation where there's these dialectical poles where we're like a dog going play fetch. Right. Oh, I have to grab this pole, otherwise I don't get the bone. And I think if we can just step back and see if we can look at the whole pole and, see, is this taking us, is it the Alf Haven climbing us up the Gnostic Jacob's ladder? Right. And that's what most of the time it is. But if we step back, sometimes we can see that neither side is the right side.
Exactly.
They both point to the same.
Right. And then realizing there's like 45 other choices that you didn't see.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just so frustrating. I think that, like you said, you nailed it, is I think that any honest, objective person, which I think is the majority, that are just being swayed or manipulated, who genuinely want good things, which is why they pretend to be good out there, would, if presented with this in a way that they was, easily digestible, would see it and go, oh, okay. But your point is that clearly they're the ones out there that I think are the most prolific and the most, are the ones that are willfully ignorant. And maybe that's not because they're manipulators. They just don't want to see it. They don't like that choice. They feel like what they're doing is more exciting, or more, whatever the number of reasons are. There's a lot of that in the conversation, and they just don't want to, or they find, and that's part of the problem, is that we have to show the other people out there how to, this is why I've talked in the past about that course for Richard Grove on like objectivity. It's like, you really have to retrain yourself after coming up for, K through 12, being forced how to pretend you're, learning the way they want you to, like deprogram yourself from that stuff. It's very difficult.
It is very difficult. And I think that's right. A lot of people who are really good, decent people, and I think they want to feel like they're doing something. So they see a movement and it looks like it's in opposition to what they don't want. Yep. Right. And so they anchor to it. Okay, I can make a difference. I'm going to join this team and we're going to fight the other team. And they feel like there's power in that. Yeah. And they feel like there's a sense of security in that, that they can actually do something and that it'll move the needle. They don't realize. And I think a lot of them don't want to see that. Wait, now they're just being trapped into advancing the agenda only, with a different banner.
How many of them do you think in that broad category commit to a choice like that? And again, on any topic, any political discussion, and then ultimately come to realize, okay, wait, they're not exactly what I thought, but then for just pure petty reasons, or whatever it is, just stick with it because you don't want to look wrong. Like what percentage would you put that in the conversation? Just guess, your personal opinion, because that's an interesting overlap, I think, to this.
I think it's somewhere between I would say somewhere between 10-15%, but it's a large percent because they're loud.
Yeah, right.
Those people they dig their heel. This is what I was saying about like the Ayn Rand people. They dig their heels in. They're very loud and they come at you. They attack you, right? Because you're supposed to be on their side.
Well, I think it's because they feel insecure about it. All of a sudden, the ground is drifting away. And you just lash out because you don't want to acknowledge. And I agree, though. I think it's too much of the conversation, and which it's everyone can decide for themselves. But the point is just to recognize that there are people out there that will just drive it to the ground. Like COVID-19 is a good example for different reasons. Is I think it was Del Bigtree that put this out that we will forever have moms, for example, that will just maybe out of just sheer just self. What's the term? Just not wanting to destroy themselves, will never admit to themselves, self-preservation, that they gave their child a shot that shortened their life almost certainly, and so that person will never, ever go. They'll just box it out. They'll ignore it or just lash out if you say it was wrong forever. And I almost kind of get it. Not that I agree with it because how you're gonna admit to yourself that you gave your entire family things or you'd force them into it in some cases that were terrible? That's hard to deal with.
You cost them their life.
Exactly.
That's a lot to live with and to be able to really look at honestly.
And to be clear, I'm not giving that a pass at all. I call that out, but I just think it's worthy of just acknowledging that there's so many different angles of why people get stuck in the illusion.
I think there's so many, and it's hard to see. It's hard to step out because they literally cast spells. I call it the wizard circle, and it's called that for a reason. You're trapped in it, so it's really hard to be able to step out and take a step back and look at the big picture. And
I'd also add too that both Courtney and I are both more than capable of acknowledging that we also could be wrong. So it's not like we have all the answers,
Well, I have my blind spots. We all sure.
Do.
We all do.
That's part of why how you're successful in this field or in anything in life is just being able to acknowledge that, stand back and go. And I think that's a huge part of what some in the paradigm more than anything drives people, even the ones that want good things or think they're doing the right thing, that you ultimately end up where you don't want in big series of conversations and you've already made a bunch of videos and all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, there's new evidence. Same kind of point I was just making, where ultimately, you fall back into line, and it's a sad thing. It happens a lot, but it's again, a larger point being that so many people within this are misled and you have to be able to stand back and acknowledge that you could have been wrong, especially when it's important, when it's, when you're informing other people. I think that's a large part of the paradigm is that people they don't want to admit it to themselves. They don't want to embrace what that means. Their heroes are no longer what they thought.
That's
it's hard.
So hard. Honestly, I feel like the AWOL Nation song plays in my head. And this year in particular, Kill Your Heroes. That's the name of the song. And it's that just echoes in my head constantly because I do believe there are heroes. That doesn't mean that they're they're gods. I don't deify them. Exactly. They're flawed humans, but I do think that people do heroic things, that people step up, they change course of history in a positive way. And I don't want to be so cynical that I never believe that.
Right.
But I have seen so much, especially in the past few years, particularly even this year, people who I really looked up to, respected, and there's just so many. It's a very tough milieu right now where there are a lot of people who, and I get it, people need to make a living. People don't want to be alone, especially the battleground is tough as it is, and times ahead look kind of precarious. So, people do seek security in whatever way they can. And unfortunately for me, that means some of my heroes die.
But again, that's a credit to you for being able to stand back and be objective about that, and it could just be that these people failed in their own right, that they're not some deceiving mastermind. They just people end up not really living to their own objective, what they want to reach. And that's, it's just important to see that.
Well, I think also sometimes people make choices where they have to weigh out where they're going to be most effective. And so they end up making compromises.
Right.
And I see those compromises as being very disappointing because I see a huge loss in movement against a really scary agenda. But the way they see it is, well, then I'm going to have no impact at all.
Right.
And so
perfect example of that, and maybe that's what you're thinking of, is RFK Jr. in that whole step. I said this before, is that the way he outlined that, you can't disagree with it. It's very logical. He laid it out very well, and that makes perfect sense. But for me, it's kind of what you were just saying. It comes down to the principle of it all. And who knows, maybe time will show that he was right, but in the moment, it's just so difficult to think, they're I guess it comes down to the idea that we always frame the selection cycle as it needs to happen now or we're all doomed. And it's like, it's not usually, I mean, right now more than ever, I'll agree. It does feel that way, but it's hard not to, see that if we don't find another path, we'll end up going through the same motions. And I felt that it was a challenge of the principles of what people wanted to support him for, and there's sure many other examples, whether you were thinking of that or not. I just think from my perspective that I felt that was it kind of threw out the door, whatever term you would use, that they leaned into him because they saw something different,
right?
And then spent the campaign trail talking about why Donald Trump would ruin the country and why, and then leans in with him, and it's just like, it's so frustrating to see that. But, again, like I've said every time about this, I know what people want from Donald Trump and what a lot of his followers believe. I hope you're right. I mean, it's silly. And here's a good way to find out whether somebody is just in this for their own personal reasons. If they're not willing to go, I hope you're right about Donald Trump.
Right.
They're a bad person. Like, I don't care. They want the country to burn down because they want to be right about Donald Trump.
Humanity just ceased to be. I mean, really. Well, my personal hope is that, there was that leaked, I think it was Crowder who got the story, but it was a leaked report from somebody inside the UN who claimed that the UN would not survive another Trump administration. And this is largely because we do know that he was starting to defund the WHO, which is part of the UN. The United States itself, you can give me your...
No, it was essentially went to Gavi, which was funding WHO anyway. And so it was like a little bit of a shell game, but you're right. He did make that move.
He did start to make, and I think he had talked about taking further steps. I know he didn't get there, but he did talk about taking further steps. But he did pull us out of the Paris Accords, which people at the UN have been saying has been a huge derailment. It's part of why they're doing their summit for the future next week, is because
which Derek will be there, by the way. So tune in for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was really hoping to go. So I'll be looking for his reporting on that. Yeah. That's great. We need more people talking about it. That's another thing very few people are talking about.
Right.
But he did do that. And then he also, the United States funds, I think, don't quote me, but I think it's 27% of the UN. And that is huge. That's a big chunk. I mean, think about there's, I think, 193 member states currently. So we fund 27%. That's almost a third. Like, that's huge. So if he were to, and I'm not saying I don't think Trump is God, I don't think he's the savior, but if he were to defund, if he would just say United States stop funding, but what this video, this leaked report said that, they didn't think he could survive that the UN could survive another Trump administration. And that would be huge. And I'm not saying, I know we had discussed, the possibility of there being some sort of repackaging. They've invested so much in this. I mean, think about this. This goes from all the way back. League of Nations was working on this. So this is even before 1946. And the plan that they've laid out, I mean, just to get to the summit of the future, this goes all the way back to that book, Our Shared Future, which was published in 1987.
A long time coming.
I mean, they've been working on this, and they've said that they're behind schedule on their Agenda 2030, and that's what this is all about, is making sure they get to that. And they've admitted that a large reason that they're behind schedule is the United States. And so that's my big hope. I think there's things I have my issues. I have my grievances with Trump. I think he is far from perfect. I don't think any human's going to be.
Right.
But if he could get us out of the UN and just make some of those, continue things like taking us out of the Paris Accord and some of these, that would be a huge step to me.
I agree. And I mean, my everyone while we're watching knows my opinion on voting in general. So that asterisk always being there. I think what's interesting though is again, the first thing I said, yes, 100%. I hope that is what happens. But I think at the end of the day, what's hard is that despite what a lot of his fan base would argue, most of the main promises in his campaign trail last time did not come to pass. And so that's just a precedent. Like just going, okay, well, he's had his time to do that. It didn't happen. So it's logical to say it probably won't happen again, but I hope it does. But then the idea about the UN, I agree with you that, I mean, there's the action, I think, was a positive step if there was follow through. So you could argue that he planned on it, but in 4 years didn't follow through with that. And maybe it was because of other things. I'd like to believe that where I always try to stand trying to be objective is that at the end of the day, it's about action and what they actually accomplished. And so if we're looking at his failed promises and his statements, lock her up, JFK, 9/11, whatever, and then to this, where it was stated it never happened, it really comes down to words. And so it really just ends up being, we hope. And so I think my problem is that what ended up happening, despite all the narrative, is the funding went through Bill Gates, which is alarming, and Gavi, which is one of the leading funders of it. So ultimately, it actually increased the funding to the WHO, was the point we made at the time. And so I'd like to see that continue to remove, but I think the problem is that what I worry about is that will end up being a move into something. My prediction would be, and again, I hope the opposite, that Trump is the guy that I don't think he is, that ultimately this is a movement to go in that right direction. But I worry that, like everything else we're seeing, it's a shell game, that he will remove this and it will be because they rolled out the new thing, and it's under the guise of the ones fighting for the freedom side, where they just kind of lull people into accepting the new version, whatever that may be, like we've seen a lot of other things. All I ask, we're very on guard for that, because I know you're especially one that is able to see through those kind of parse manipulations, right? Whereas you may feel differently about some of these people. Good that we have different opinions, but I find that you're always very capable of going, okay, wait a minute, like that is still the same agenda.
Oh,
which a lot of people aren't in the partisanship,
Sure.
Not to say that you're in that, but I mean, that are trapped in it.
Oh, and Vance is awful. I mean, I can see this total situation where they assassinate Trump so they can have their Peter Thiel puppet, JD Vance. I can totally see that. I hope that does not happen.
Yeah.
But I can totally see that.
Scary.
I absolutely, of course, they want to push through their agenda come hell or high water there. But here's the other thing that I do really want to encourage people to take ownership of, is that people do have personal agency.
Absolutely.
Free will has not been completely eradicated as of yet. They're working very hard on it. They're trying to create the noosphere, but as of today, we still have individual personal agency and free will. And that means that there is the capacity for the individual to be a disruptor.
Absolutely.
And this is not to say, I mean, I don't love all of the Trump fans. Again, we're dealing with flawed humans.
Right. On both sides, as I'm sure you agree. It's ridiculous partisanship.
Well, Kamala. I have.
Oh, sorry. Afterward, go
okay.
ahead.
That is. I think it's funny though. Just a little tangent, but Oprah and Kamala are doing some sort of live stream today, and so I asked right underneath it. I said, "So will you be uniting so that you can so we can be unburdened by what has been?"
Right. Bean, the way she says it too. It's silly.
The Baphomet signal. Anyway, but I do think there are some. This isn't to say there aren't good, decent people who are, supporting Kamala. I don't know how they wrap their heads around that. But
it plays both ways, I think.
But I can't understand them as well. But I do think that there are people in the movement who could really be disruptors.
Absolutely.
And that's way more powerful than Trump as a president. We don't want a dictator, right? But we do want people who are going to stand up, and hopefully. I also think there's a lot of economic principles, and even if they're just a conduit, which it could be, but even if it in the meantime gives people a little bit of breathing room, that does lay groundwork for individual people to take action.
That's a good point.
And especially locally.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, something that I've been talking about a lot, like that's an excellent point to argue, even if it ends up worse in the long run, the point is that you have that opening for the potential to push back more. But it's a dangerous choice. I'm sure you'd agree. Like the idea that we may very well be consenting to the problem in order to have that, you know what I mean? Like, as opposed to, I'm arguing, like, as I'm sure we could talk about more, like a different, like Catherine argued, we had a conversation about this, about the machine's broken, we need to build new parts. And I'm like, we need a new machine, right? We need to be doing an entirely new thing. And so these are very different conversations in the same general starting point. But you made an excellent point right there. Like the idea that even if that's the wrong choice, or even if they're both the wrong choice, that we have one might allow more of an opening. I can understand that for sure. What I was going to say, Kamala, though, which is like, what's funny, and I get framed as being like more aggressive, anti this or that. And you know my opinion. I think they're both ridiculous, and I'm very anti every politician and government for that matter. But what's funny is the reason I think I'm focusing more on highlighting the things around Trump is one, I think Kamala Harris is just like a cardboard stand. She's ridiculous. They're such a, like, even, I forgot to say this, even the UN pointed this. It's like, I argue that a lot of these things, like that the UN won't exist if Trump's in it. It's like, well, most people are like, well, good, vote for Trump. It's like, I feel like a lot of these things, and this is just from my perspective, is the illusion is the all encompassing, that it's driving you right now to want to vote for Trump. That's the selection, in my opinion. And I think that's, it's hard to see how everything is like, Well, that's just silly. Like Kamala Harris, them coming out, or Walls saying that your free speech isn't applied. It's like, and everybody with objectivity is going to go, well, that's crazy. Like that's not nobody, and so that it drives you to go, at least for the guy who pretends about free speech, and that's what I really worry about all that. But my point was that Kamala just represents like this objectively silly thing. Like everybody everywhere thought she was the worst politician. And then it's like, no, she's a hero and she's saving freedom. And not even Democrats believe that. Like they have their, like I saw, the team sport politics side that'll go, yay, no matter what, for whoever you put in front of.
She's a woman and she's a black woman. She used to be Indian, but she's black
all
now.
That matters, right? But my point is that I think that the large body before that was, I mean, even the Democratic polls would say she's one of the most unliked. Yeah. And so my point is that at a root point, most of them are like, even if they're pretending right now, like we know that's not true. So I just think a lot of this seems ridiculous. And so it's easy to point out how bad she is in 1,000 different ways. Trump is a little bit more of a different animal, where there's a lot of people, and I see some of the reasons why, fixate on that and want that. And I'm trying to highlight that here's an example of why she's a monster. That's obvious, but here's somebody that you might not see it, And I get that can seem like we're focusing one or the other, but that's my logic to it.
Right.
I think, and again, it really does come back to the point that I don't think your vote translates. And I think that this is the choice. And so I want to make sure people understand what that really means, And again, I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I really hope. I mean,
I hope you're wrong too. Not because I want you to be wrong, but because
we should all
of the stakes.
Yeah. It's terrifying.
Terrifying.
I mean, if you think about the Thiel and the Musk and the, all these different points of how this could come together. If they're not good guys, we should be scared about that.
Yeah.
It's alarming.
Absolutely. To your point about the machine, like if it's broken, my take on that is a little bit more nuanced because I do think the machine is broken. Although we could argue maybe it was designed to be broken. There's
you and I will always agree on that.
Yeah, there's an argument to be made there. But I think that if you abandon the machine that is the primary infrastructure without having viable alternatives in place,
right?
I think then you literally create a vehicle for the chaos that they need to impose their usurpation of power.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point. Well, it's twofold. Is that one? I think that's inevitable. Even if you have everything ready, it will still be framed as like terrorism, chaos, because it's the antithesis of the current machine. They're going to go, no, like they're ruining everything. It's a dying animal lashing out from the corner, whatever you want to call it. It's clear that they would do that no matter how successful it was what you were doing. But your point is well taken, that a lot of people just don't know where to go next, or they're just kind of bucking the whole thing, and that will effectively cause in some ways what they want to point to.
Yeah.
So I think that it comes down to the all larger, Derek's work on this, but exit and build is very important. The idea, not just like moving into the wilderness, but exiting from these systems, but while still participating. Like you can vote if you think that makes a difference, but I'm more talking about just still pushing back, highlighting these problems, standing up, speaking, rallies, whatever else, but then also simultaneously trying to build alternative systems that could eventually challenge that. I think that's where we need to be focusing.
I think that's great. I think both simultaneously.
Yes.
I'm all for that. Otherwise, it is just like a Prospera Galt operation.
Yeah. Or at least could be framed that way.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely a good point. Yeah. I mean, I think this whole thing is such an interesting time because it has built to such a fever pitch. And I think, maybe it's no different than every other one before. And we're just, hyped right now, but I do sense that it's different. I really do. And maybe it's because the agendas that are kind of building around it, that they seem more possible than ever. Go ahead.
And not only that, but the action they're taking. The Summit of the Future is this week coming up, like they're really taking these steps, and they've got so much momentum and power behind them in that.
Yeah.
And I know you said that a lot of it seems so silly, like Kamala Harris, nobody buys it. But a lot of people do. The propaganda is very effective. And you had people who originally would have just laughed at her, who now are saying she's a hero.
Well, do you think that they would? I would agree. Yeah. But I think there's a huge portion of that are people that would have agreed with a cardboard box if it had a Democrat sticker on it. I'm serious. Like they're just like, that's the choice. So yay. Like for example, Quentin Tarantino, an interview with Bill Maher. Explicitly said that. Like, I don't think she's doing anything. I don't care what she says. I'm voting for Kamala. And I'm just like, what an idiot. Like, this is a child response. Like, you have given up, even though you frame it as the what adults do. It's crazy to me.
Well, there's truth in that. But what I was going to point out was like with the UN and their messaging, it's couched in really nice platitudes, and it's very enticing because everything's inverted. And so when they use a word like you talked about the fragility, right?
Mhm.
That's an example. They're really talking, it's an inversion.
Yeah.
They don't mean fragility in the same way that
Or sustainability.
or sustainability is a great example. So if a land were actually sustainable, permaculture would be really truly sustainable. It basically takes care of itself.
They're sustaining themselves.
Yes. But for them,
power.
sustainability means everything's GMO and synthetic and terraformed.
I genuinely think that's from their mind. It's the sustainability of their system and what they need
That is
and
what
their
they
power.
mean. It's like democracy, oligarchical rule.
Yeah.
That's what they mean. So they've inverted all these words, but people who don't know. That's why when somebody responded on Twitter saying like, I need a college course just to understand this tweet. And I understand why. It's like, well, if you've grown up thinking a word means something, and now you're reading this very flowery text where all these words that you think mean something else, because there's the exoteric messaging and then there's the esoteric. And I'm not even talking about, although there are like occult operations and secret societies, there's all of that. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm literally just talking about they have one thing that they put out that the public sees, and then everybody who's been inducted knows what they're talking about. And it's the inverse of that.
Right. I mean, we've seen this a lot. We've talked about this over the years. I mean, even the word regime change, the term, that was a conspiracy theory not that long ago. Like, it was like, we don't do that. Like, even though it was most people even still knew, then it was like, okay, well, now we're like, you've seen it used these days as we're going to regime change for democracy, And so that's always how that works, or sustainability, or any number of words where, they take it, they invert it, they use it for themselves. And the point becomes then I'm saying regime change or any other number of other words, thinking about one thing, and you're hearing it thinking about something else.
Exactly.
And we think we're on the same page, and there's so many levels of how that works. And I think the election is like built around all sorts of different manipulations just like that to drive people, like you said, there's a lot of flowery words and nice phrases and different, but how often do these things really come to pass from either side? The things they promise, what they float, it's always, I mean, if any of it, it's usually most of it ends up being, well, the other side wouldn't let us, or here's why we couldn't, or here's why this is better. And even if that's the truth, the point is, well, it didn't happen. It's like, well, those of us over here going, we're watching for 40 years long, it's the same thing every time.
I don't want to completely undermine, though, because we may see the end result. That's what's revealed to us. We don't know what was going on behind scenes.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And we don't know how many plans were curtailed, derailed.
Totally.
And so I don't want to, again, people have agency and they can be disruptors. So
absolutely,
although we may see the show we get, the message we get is, oh, well, none of that happened. And so it was all just words.
Well, my point was exactly what you're saying. And that's why we should do that. Because my point is that it's really, whatever the reason, the outcome is clear, right? So the point would be that you need to be a disruptor. You need to get involved, and you need to act to change this linear, it's really left, right, whatever's been happening. Look back as long as you want. We're seemingly on this kind of linear incline, just constantly going in the same direction, a little bit of deviation, but it just continues.
Right.
And so who knows whether one side's been trying to stop it or not. I mean, I disagree, or I wouldn't think that. But I think at the end of the day, if all we can see is that it still happens anyway, your point is right. Is that we just need to find ways to change this and stop relying on these individuals to change it for us.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, definitely. We should all take whatever action we can.
Absolutely.
I tell everybody, get involved wherever you're passionate, because whatever your interests are, that's where your strengths, talents, and resources lie.
Yeah.
So if we all take care of that, then we'd have a great ecosystem, and we might effectuate some change.
Absolutely. Self-responsibility. Well, I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
I think that was a good conversation. I really hope people will take the time to consider these things, flesh them out, and not come at them from a certain partisan angle, right? You really have to do that with any of these things, is take the information from an objective lens and think about how it may apply. Ask yourself whether you could be wrong about X, Y, or Z, and really think about it. Because, as much as things get framed one side or the other these days, there are people out there, I would argue, like us, who are simply trying to bring you facts for you to decide for yourself. And it's as much as that may seem like what everyone's pretending they're doing, most of them are not. So thank you for tuning in today. We'll be coming, hopefully, more often now that who knows, we'll both get busy and get lots going on, but we're going to try to do this more often. I really do love doing this to you. I love this show.
I do too.
It's fun.
Yeah, super fun.
So anything else you want to leave us with on the way out?
Well, You can check out my Twitter. I'm going to retweet it so that it's at the top, but how we can bypass this deadline of the Sustains Act. So it's just a little call to action. I won't read it because the link that actually works is super long and complicated, I think by design. We can give them the benefit of the doubt, but there's also this Lisa Bertelson who has said you can direct all these emails. So I think we should just flood her inbox and see if we can stop this, because if they take control over these environmental services, they completely have purview over all the land in America.
Right.
And that's pretty horrifying to me. So I would say that I'm on Twitter at Courtenay. I spell my name like Courtenay, COURTENAYTURNER, or you can go to my website, CourtenayTurner.com, and that will have all my, socials, and you can link there. Also, if you want to check out the Cognitive Liberty Conference, we did go into a lot of detail on the dialectic. The second day, the first day was all focused on education. And how they use dialectical tactics to dumb us down and breed compliance and what people can do. There were some really hopeful kind of like personal testimonies of homeschooling and like alternative schooling models. So that was very encouraging. We didn't just leave you with all the doom. We gave you some possible solutions. So that was great. And then the second day was all focused on the history of the dialectic, how they use it for political and psychological warfare. So I know it sounds like a very academic kind of highfalutin word, and it has very deep philosophical, I would argue actually like hermetic roots. So this is going back millennia, but the tactics actually are pretty simple. And so I think, but if somebody wants a clearer understanding, that's cognitiveliberityconference.com. And we have the replay up there so you can get your tickets and watch.
Outstanding. Well, I'll include that. And her links for Twitter and everything else are already down below in the show notes. So make sure you check it out, give it a share, make sure people see what's going on. I mean, she does some amazing work. So make sure you check it out. And as always, everybody out there, remain a dissident.
Yes.